All right. Welcome everybody. It's the last week of the last lecture of the semester, so it's kind of weird doing this via Zoom, but we'll see how we go. So I sent out an email about the analysis piece yesterday. Hopefully that answered most of the questions you have still about it. There's been a couple of emails regarding referencing, and my stance on the referencing is that I'm assuming that you're going to be using some of the ideas from the Law Commission review and the National Drug Policy. So you don't need to worry about citing those things every time they come up. If you have read other things, or if you have other evidence or things to back up what you're saying, you can cite that stuff. But what I don't want to see is just a lot of citations of the Law Commission review, one sentence Law Commission review, one sentence National Drug Policy. So if you just say at the outset, I'm going to be considering evidence from both of these documents or recommendations, that's fine. You don't have to worry about being real formal with the citations. So hopefully that's helpful. I think most of the other stuff was covered in my email. So if you still run into other things, let me know. And yeah, got a few more days to finish that up. So if you run into problems, then let me know. Don't get stuck and feel like you can't move on it without sending me an email or coming in to see me. So we're gonna finish up what we were talking about on Monday, and my whole point with Monday's lecture was to try to sort of set the stage to talking about this dislocation theory of addiction, right? And particularly what we discussed was how the transition from the Middle Ages, kind of like agricultural economies, to sort of a more capitalist free market type economy and society in Western society, was accompanied by these events that produce dislocation on a massive scale, right? So we talked about things like the enclosures, the highland clearances, several hundred years worth of colonialism, and all of this stuff has led to this kind of social context where certain groups are more vulnerable to negative health outcomes, and addiction is is one of those, right? But it's one thing for me to sit here and say capitalism is bad and it produces all of these problems, and addiction is one of them. And it's another thing for me to give you some evidence of that, right? There's a lot of people talking about how bad capitalism is, and some of them make more sense than others. And so what I said at the end of the lecture on Monday was that, okay, well, one of the really harmful things that free market ideology has resulted in is this dislocation via colonialism, right? Like killing or displacing or marginalizing minority groups. But that, as we discussed on Monday, has resulted from this kind of intergenerational trauma, right? So it's hard to really say, well, that's specific to what capitalism does, because a lot of things can produce that kind of intergenerational trauma. So what I want to do today is to try to point to something that's taken place on a much shorter time scale, right? Because colonialism has taken place since the 1400s. And it's really hard to sort of to pin specific outcomes on the effects of capitalism, generally speaking, because it's had such a pervasive intergenerational effect. So what I want to do today is point to something on a shorter time scale where I feel pretty confident that I can say this is a specific effect of capitalism, and it's a dislocation of a certain group of people, which we can point to as being involved in higher rates of addiction. Okay, so we'll see how we go. So I want to talk about the opioid epidemic. We've talked about this a little bit during the semester, and it's this is just one stat of many. You can find hundreds of figures like this on the internet. From around 1999 to today, we're still rising. There's been a historic spike in drug overdose deaths in the United States, and actually in other countries it's happening as well. We're starting to see an increase here in New Zealand. Okay, so around 16,000 or around almost 17,000 in 99 to almost 100,000 last year. And if you just take a second to think about those numbers, I think it's easy for us to get sort of numbed to massive casualty numbers. But if you think about that, almost 100,000 people died of a drug related overdose. That's a whole lot of people, all right? That's a whole lot of families that are losing mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, brothers. And so my hypothesis is that if the dislocation theory of addiction has merit, if this idea that certain groups of people, or when a person feels dislocated from their social, emotional, psychological sense of well-being in society, that makes them more susceptible to addiction, that if that's correct, then addiction should be highest in places showing the most dislocation. Okay, we've talked about that generally, but if we want to talk about dislocation that's specifically related to capitalism, we have to start thinking in economic terms, right? So one of the things that is a specific feature of free market capitalism is the fact that jobs are not safe, okay? Corporations and companies have no loyalty to their employees. They have loyalty to their shareholders. And so most of these big companies look around for places that are going to provide them with the cheapest amount of labor so that they can extract the most amount of profit from those people. All right, so one index of that is the number of manufacturing jobs lost due to offshoring, which is moving jobs overseas. Because if you can get some child in Indonesia to make your products for pennies a day, then you don't have to pay people in the United States to do it, right? So anytime you hear the words free trade or free trade agreement, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about international agreements to let corporations come into different countries and set up factories so that they can extract the most amount of labor for the cheapest price. Okay, so that's what free trade means. And it produces all kinds of problems with indigenous people getting pushed out of their ancestral lands. It's essentially a form of colonialism, which is headed up by corporations today. Okay, so that's what offshoring is moving jobs out of the country somewhere else with no no responsibility to the employees who may have been employed for years, or automation, right? So another thing is when you have factory work, it's a bunch of people who have been reduced to essentially performing one task on an assembly line, right? And if you can get robots to do this, then this can be a lot cheaper than having to pay people as well, right? So one important index of dislocation that results from capitalism is loss of manufacturing jobs to offshoring or automation. And this also affects the average wage for work. Okay, so if we start thinking about dislocation in these types of conceptual ways, then what we can do is we can look at economic data over the course of the last few decades, and we can start to paint a picture of who will be most susceptible to dislocation that is a function of capitalism. And then we can look at addiction in those people, right? So what is the relationship between manufacturing job loss and overdose in the current opioid crisis? Remember, we're going back just 20 years. That's a lot shorter of a time scale than 600 years since 1492 or whatever, even before then in other places. So this might give us a way to look at our question in a way that we can start to make sense of. Okay, so first, just the general stats, and we're going to stick with the United States because they have some of the most comprehensive data on this issue. And as I stated before, they are the country where this type of free market capitalist ideology is most entrenched. And so they're in a really advanced stage of capitalism where you're starting to see these issues happening with more and more frequency. Okay, so this is from 1970 until 2014. These are US manufacturing employment jobs, all right? And what you can see is that from 1970 to around mid 80s, well, actually to around the 90s, they bounced around a little bit, but they were mostly pretty stable. From the early 2000s, you start to see this huge dip in manufacturing jobs, okay? So they're just, the US economy is just shedding manufacturing jobs like crazy, all right? And they start to tick up a little bit in 2014, but they're never going to get back to this level, all right? And there's a few reasons for that. So the next question we have to ask is, okay, who's lost the most jobs? These are the geographical areas of the US. So this area here, the red one is called the Midwest, it's the South, and the West and the Northeast. So if we look at these different geographical areas, we can ask, okay, well, if we think that job loss is, manufacturing job loss is a good indicator of potential dislocation because of capitalist systems, who's losing the most jobs, okay? And what we can see here is that the Midwest, which is this area right here, is in a much worse state than the rest of the United States in terms of their manufacturing job loss. Okay, so this is just manufacturing jobs over the course of 20 years. You can see that there's been dips and there's been increases, but the Midwest has never caught up to the rest of the United States. So they are kind of in the hole in terms of losing these kinds of jobs, which can help us sort of zero in on this particular area of the country, okay? Now, this graph looks kind of busy, but what it basically says is in 2007, there was what's called a Great Recession, which is when the world and the US economy took a major hit and people started losing jobs. And it happens every few years in these types of economies, is there's just a recession. Now, in 2007 was when this Great Recession was supposed to have occurred. And but what these data show, and what this article that I got these data from show, is that, well, it actually began 6 years earlier for the Midwest. So in 2001, not 2007. So this part of the country actually had a bigger economic recession that lasted longer than the rest of the country. And this is basically just shown by, this is an unemployment statistic, okay? So the South the Midwest is in red, the West is in orange, and the Northeast is in gray. What you can see here is that the share, the percentage of jobs lost from 2000 to 2007, it was greater in the Midwest was greater than from 2007 to 2016 in the Midwest. In all these other areas, the recession began in 2007, and you can see that because the light colors have a much greater percentage of jobs lost in that period of time. And this breaks it down by women and men. But basically what these data are showing is that people were losing jobs more and earlier in the Midwest than they were in the rest of the United States. Okay, so we're gathering data to build our case for the main argument here. Okay, this also affects wages, right? Because if more people are looking for work, that depresses wages, right? Employers don't have to pay as much because people are willing to work for less because more of them don't have jobs. And what this is showing is that regardless of, this is the wage growth across particular years for these particular geographic areas. Regardless of whether you look at 2000 to 2007 or 2007 to 2016, wages in the Midwest are particularly bad in their growth over this period of time, right? They're way lower than any of these other geographical areas. And in particular, the wage growth for men is much worse than it is for women, but much worse in 2000 to 2007 than anywhere else in the country, okay? And this, well, this is going to become clear in just a second why this might be the case. Okay, this is just another indication of economic recession. And that is that the manufacturing wage premium has collapsed since 1983. What that is the percentage of increased wages that can be gained by having a manufacturing job. So it's essentially it's a metric of how competitive manufacturing jobs are compared to other types of jobs. And so what you can see is that from 83 to around 98, 99, manufacturing jobs paid much better than other jobs, comparatively to other jobs. But then now what's happened is since 99, 2000, 2001, that increased benefit of working a manufacturing job has actually decreased, which is essentially another way of saying more people have been laid off, more people are looking for work, companies are depressing their wages and not paying people as much as they used to, okay? So it's another index of job loss that's really affected the Midwest. Okay, so all of this is building up to a picture of the Midwest as really suffering from these particular types of job losses in the manufacturing sector. Well, can we zero in even more than that? Because the Midwest is pretty huge, right? It's this whole kind of area. And if we want to talk about specific types of manufacturing jobs, then we can talk about something called the Rust Belt in the US. And it's called the Rust Belt because there's a whole bunch of automotive factories in these areas. These were sort of the automobile manufacturing capitals of the US since automobiles started being manufactured. So you have this area of the country, which comprises part of the Midwest, but also bleeds into some of the Northeast, which is called the Rust Belt, okay? So if we zero in on the Rust Belt, what we can see is, this is the percent change in manufacturing employment in Rust Belt states from 1970 to 2014. And it's just been a downward trajectory, right? More and more manufacturing jobs are being lost in the Rust Belt compared to other places in the US, okay? So now we're starting to get a picture, okay, not only is it the Midwest, but it's in these particular areas which have a history of having these types of manufacturing jobs, which are most susceptible to disruption by the forces of the free market, right? And so this is just, it's not just offshoring. So it's not just taking jobs from workers in the United States and shipping them overseas, but it's automation as well, right? So what this shows is how prevalent industrial robots are across the places in the United States. And basically what you can see is that that area of the Midwest, the Rust Belt, that whole kind of area that we've been seeing lose a lot of these types of jobs is just having a boom in robots, right? So that means more people are getting laid off. The people who are actually still employed, the wages are going down. And this is what you can just see here, another way of looking at it, which is basically showing the manufacturing employment in millions of people versus the manufacturing output in billions of dollars, okay? And what you can see here is that from 1950 to around 1980, there was a steady increase in the number of people who were hired for these manufacturing kind of jobs, right? But what happened in 1980 was that people started, there were a lot of international trade agreements that were agreed to by a bunch of different countries in the 80s, right? This is the Ronald Reagan era. And so jobs start to get lost. And then in 2000, with the recession, they just crater, right? So these manufacturing jobs are being lost, but the manufacturing output has maintained pace and even increased a little bit. So basically what that means is that companies are still able to manufacture their product, but they're having to hire less people to do so. And automation, bringing in robots that do the job of people, is one big way that that happens, as is shipping jobs overseas, where you can skirt employment mandates by employing underage workers or people who sort of fall below the radar in terms of regulation and international guidelines. Okay, so all of this stuff is leading to a picture of the Rust Belt, this area that has lost the most manufacturing jobs, to be hardest hit by this type of a scenario. And so what I want to ask now is, okay, well, what about opioid overdose deaths? Because if we want to look at, if we think that there might be some connection between this type of job loss, dislocation, feeling lost in your own skin kind of thing, not feeling a part of society, your whole world kind of coming crashing down. These are sort of the symptoms of dislocation. Is it related to opioid overdose death? Okay. So now that we've painted a picture of the Rust Belt and the Midwest as having suffered extremely because of these manufacturing job losses, who has been overdosing the most? Okay. So I looked at this paper, came out a couple of years ago. And what they did is they assessed, so they analyzed records from the CDC of 351,564 people who had died from opioid-related causes from 1999 to 2016. Okay, and what they measured was the opioid-related mortality rate, the annual percent change in opioid-related mortality rate, and the life expectancy lost at age 15 years. And what this this is a cool indicator, a useful indicator, because not only does it show you the percentage of people who have died at a given time in different geographical locations, it shows you how much that percentage is changing over years, right? So it can show you if, like, say, 10 people died in one county in 1 year, and then 20 people died the next year. It can quantify that change in the percentage. So it's not only does it give you an idea of the overall problem of opioid overdose, but it gives you an idea of which areas are getting worse more quickly. Okay, and so this is what the data look like. Okay, so this is all opioids, natural opioids, heroin they looked at specifically, and synthetic opioids. And the colors go from light to dark, from white to purple, indicate the rate of change of opioid overdose. So purple and red, and pink, dark pink, are indicative of places where the opioid overdose rate is increasing faster than other places in the country. Okay. And if we think about the opioid overdose epidemic, a lot of people think that it's driven a lot by these prescription drugs, right? These synthetic opioids. And what I just want to point your attention to here is this, right? This includes the area that we've been talking about, the Rust Belt, right? The place in the United States that is showing the greatest mortality rate and the greatest increasing mortality rate. It includes this area that we've been talking about. That includes this this massive loss of jobs due to automation and due to offshoring. Okay, and if you look at another measure, which is the number of years of life expectancy lost, which is kind of a measure like we talked about before, which is the daily, right? The disability adjusted life years. What you can see here is that we have a similar picture, right? If you calculate all opioids, there's other areas that start to pop up. Now, remember, this is just this isn't an explicit measure of overdose, but this is a measure of opioid related disability and overdose. But for our purposes, what's important here is that you still see, with the synthetic opioids, you still see this area coming in darkest, right, in the United States. And so in terms of conclusions, what this little exercise has shown is that places in the US that lost the most manufacturing jobs were among the highest in opioid overdose deaths and years of life lost to opioid use. So what I suggest, and what my whole point in this lecture is that dislocation caused by offshoring and automation of jobs contributed substantially to the increased rates of opioid use and overdose. But I would be a pretty rubbish scientist if I gave that to you as definitive proof of what I'm talking about, because that analysis was mine, right? And I didn't even do it formally. I kind of looked at a few graphs of where jobs were lost and looked at where the opioid epidemic was most severe. This study didn't actually assess the impact of manufacturing job loss on opioid overdose. So it could be that I just hate capitalism and I'm just trying to make stuff up, right? I'm trying to convince you guys that it's bad, so I'm tying it to opioid overdose. It might just be a nice story. Anybody can make up a nice story, right? So what I wanted to do next was ask, okay, well, surely there are people out there who have looked at this question explicitly. And it turns out that there are not not too many, because not a lot of people have looked at things that are explicitly related to the way that capitalism operates. People look at things like economic factors considered generally, right? Employment, unemployment, wages, job loss, that kind of thing. But not too many people have looked at the specific impacts that are a key feature of these types of free market systems that just move jobs around, have no loyalty to employees, expect employees to go where the jobs are, don't care if they get fired after however many years because they can get a better, they can get cheaper labor somewhere else. So has anybody looked at this specifically? And I found a couple of articles. So there's this one that came out in 2019 called Free Trade and Opioid Overdose Death in the United States. And what these people did is they looked at the relationship between overdose deaths, but they specifically looked at those deaths in counties that had lost manufacturing jobs versus those that hadn't. And they looked at data from 1999 to 2015. So I don't think it's just a coincidence that the time period that has seen a big change, a big increase in the number of manufacturing jobs that have been lost corresponds to this this opioid epidemic, right? So they looked at data from 1999 to 2015. And what did they find? In those counties that they looked at, this is a very similar picture to what we've seen before, right? So from 1999 to 2016 or 15, you see this big increase in opioid-related overdose deaths. And you see it as well in just the number of counties reporting opioid deaths. So there's an increase. We know this, right? It's an opioid epidemic. And they found a similar result in just the counties that they looked at, right? Now, remember what they did is they quantified the loss of manufacturing jobs in these different counties, and they came up with this map, okay? So this is trade-related job losses per 10,000 population. And so this is, the white is 0 to 1, the gray is 1 to 3, and the black is greater than 3. So we're talking about, depending on your county, 3 per 10,000 could lead to substantial job losses, right? And what you can see is that these are concentrated in certain areas. And what you also need to keep in mind is that some of these counties that look really big over here in the West don't have as many people as these counties here over here in the East. But what I want you to pay particular attention to here is this area, which is known as Appalachia. It has 8% of the US population, but in the time period that was measured, it suffered 16% of trade-related job losses, okay? So a doubling of the percentage of job losses specifically related to free trade, whether that's automation, whether that's offshoring, compared to its population. And it had the highest percentage of overdose deaths to total population percentage of anywhere in the United States. So for how many people live in these areas, they had the highest percentage of overdose deaths according to this analysis. And you can see very clearly a couple of things from this figure. Okay, what you can see is that from 99 to 2015, there's just a massive increase in the number of opioid overdose deaths, right? And that doesn't matter whether or not the counties have trade-related job losses that are above average or below average. There's an increase either way. But what you can see here is that counties with trade-related job losses that are above average are consistently and systematically and statistically greater in their number of overdose deaths. Okay, so there's something above and beyond whatever else is going on to produce these opioid overdose deaths that can be attributed specifically to the loss of jobs due to free trade. Okay, so counties with more trade-related job losses had higher overdose rates. And what they did is they were able to quantify based on their analysis 1,000 trade-related job losses equaled a 2.7% increase in overdose deaths. Okay, and this percentage increases to 11.3% if fentanyl is in the local heroin supply. So we talked about fentanyl. It's an opioid. It's way more potent than heroin. Dealers and suppliers of heroin cut their heroin with fentanyl when supplies get lower, when they just want to push their product, they want to make their product extend a little bit further. And so if you're used to a certain dose of heroin and you get some that's cut with fentanyl, you're going to die. Okay, that's going to be an overdose. And so there's a massive increase when they've detected fentanyl in the local heroin supply. But here's the most important part, is because this study, this regression study, used a whole bunch of different variables to make sure that they could really point to these trade-related job losses as the culprit here. So these differences can't be accounted for by differences in population, per capita income, unemployment rates, opioid prescription patterns, which is a big one because a lot of people are saying it has nothing to do with economic factors. It's all about doctors pushing these pills on people. Well, this says no, that's not the case. Population density, racial demographics, and here's another key one. What they did is they also calculated how related opioid overdose deaths were to other types of layoffs that were unrelated to trade. So other types of job losses that are not specific to free market capitalism did not result in an increase in overdose deaths, right? So that right there is kind of convincing evidence that there's something specific about the effect of trade-related jobs on dislocation, or on the mental or emotional status of people who suffered from these job losses that contributes to the overdose deaths. Okay, and it also, another thing that people say a lot is that it has to do with different characteristics of individual states. Different states are different. They have different kinds of issues, different kinds of problems. They controlled for all of that, and their results were still significant. Okay, so I want to go through one other study, and then we can go through some questions if you guys have any. But there's another study that was published just last year. And what these guys did is they looked at a specific type of manufacturing job loss. What they did is they assessed differences between overdose deaths in counties that had or had not experienced the closure of an automotive assembly plant. So this is like your quintessential kind of manufacturing factory job in the States that's, happens in industrialized places, that is real susceptible to these specific pressures of free trade, automation, and offshoring, right? So what they did is they looked at the difference between overdose deaths in counties that had or had not experienced the closure of an automotive assembly plant. And this is just a sample of some of their counties that they looked at. Okay, so they had more counties that didn't have a closure of an automobile plant, but they had some, and they're spread out in a bunch of different places. They looked at over 200 counties, over 100 counties. And what this is a lot of information, but basically what I just want to underline here is that there are no statistically significant differences between these two types of counties at baseline. So before the event happened that they're measuring. All right. So anything that you would attribute to differences that were sort of pre-existing, that's out the window. Okay. Now, what this does is these figures, 0.0 is the time that the automobile manufacturing plant closed. Okay. And so what you can see, what this gives you is 5 years prior and 7 years after the automobile manufacturing plant closed. And what you can see is that while there's an upward trend in the mortality rate, after the manufacturing plant closed or a control time point for the other counties, you see this increase in the mortality rate for the counties that had a plant that closed. Right, it was actually below the no closure places, and then it increased and went above, and then started increasing at a higher rate. And what they've done for the rest of the study is calculated a difference in these measures, and they present a difference from here on out. So this is a different way of looking at the same data. And what you can see is that at baseline, there wasn't really any difference in the mortality between those counties, but after plant closure, the difference in the counties that had those plants was significantly greater, right? So the rate of the incidence of opioid overdose was significantly greater in places that had a closure of an automotive plant than in counties that did not have one. And this is another way of looking at it here. This is just breaking it down by whether or not these are prescription opioids or heroin or other illicit opioids. And what you can see is the same kind of pattern. No difference in the baseline period, and an increase in the post-closure period, meaning that there were increased overdose deaths in counties that had the closure of an automobile plant. And here we have what I consider to be a real key piece of data. Because one of the things that we've talked about that makes it so hard to assess relatively acute impacts of dislocation produced by capitalism is that you have a real long history of intergenerational trauma that can interact with various things and produce dislocation in minority groups. Okay, so in the Americas, African Americans, people from Mexico, so Latino Americans, Pacific Islanders, other groups that are a minority of the population in some areas, have a long history of colonial trauma, we'll call it, right? And like that person in the video said, there's residues of that kind of stuff that kind of bleeds out into a lot of different aspects of life. Now, white people, especially a few generations removed from any kind of immigration, became this kind of homogenized group. And I'm probably overgeneralizing, but by and large, if you're a white person in the States, you don't suffer from the same kind of endemic and systemic discrimination and racism that these other groups do, which can contribute to dislocation, right? And so the reason why I find these data so compelling is because what they show is that when you break it down by demographics, racial demographics, the people who display the biggest increase in overdose deaths related to trade related loss of a manufacturing job in an automotive plant are white men. Okay, and that's significant because this is a group that traditionally in the United States would not suffer the kinds of dislocation that we're talking about that's related to this history of colonialism that's associated with capitalism. But they are susceptible to an acute incident of dislocation that's associated specifically with capitalism in this instance, right? So they lose their job. Maybe there's been several generations of people working in factories, right? Their dad worked in a factory, their grandpa worked in a factory. A lot of their relatives worked in factories. So their life is kind of this this manufacturing factory lifestyle. When they lose that job, that just unmoors them from their place in the world, right? So they suffer dislocation specifically because of these types of events, which can't be accounted for by the type of dislocation that's suffered by people with a history of colonial trauma. Okay, so these data, I think more than any others, underscore the validity of this argument that a feature of capitalist societies is this type of dislocation, okay? So in summary, automotive plant closure was associated with an 85% increase in overdose deaths compared to counties without closures. These results couldn't be accounted for by baseline differences, and the demographic associated with the greatest increase in overdose deaths was white men. And this, for the reasons I've discussed, is the demographic that is most likely to suffer dislocation as a result of this specific type of job loss that's associated with free trade and capitalism. So there's a question here. I saw a question pop up and it was kind of long, so I didn't get a chance to, let's see. So this is a big question, right, Dante? Because you're saying that is it a problem with capitalism in particular, or is it a problem with other systems that don't provide enough support for people? And I would say that my personal opinion, and I think there's plenty of data to support this, is that capitalist systems produce this particular kind of outcome because of their single-minded focus on corporate profits, okay? And I don't actually agree with what you said about capitalism ensuring efficient allocation of resources. Well, efficient from the perspective of the corporations making the most profit while paying their workers the least amount of wages. Yes, and efficient in terms of globalization, but when you have a place like the United States where corporations basically run the country, and I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist, this is actually the case. Like they basically control both parties in the government with their special interests and their lobbyists. They are so strenuously against any kind of taxation of corporations or wealthy people to fund the kind of programs you're talking about, education, support, job training, that this disparity is is endemic of systems where capitalism is just allowed to run rampant. So that's what I think about that. So yeah, I mean, that's my that's my spiel. That's my final lecture. My point is that we live in a society where we're prioritizing individualism over relationships, and we're prioritizing politically profits over people, and it's catching up with us. And it's not the only factor, but I think particularly this analysis of the opioid epidemic can really give us something to think about in terms of what promoting this type of a society and ideology is doing to the people in society. We're suffering dislocation, and we're suffering from addiction, and yeah.
Ryan,
So
can I ask a
there's
question?
a couple of videos, which I'm not going to show now, but you can go ahead and watch them if you like on your own time. But I just want to say thank you guys for semester. I know it's been a weird one, but hopefully you found the course useful. And I would just, yeah, make sure you fill out a course evaluation form. And I've enjoyed the time we've been able to spend together, and hopefully you guys have a good rest of the semester.
Can I ask a question, Ryan, before you go?
Yeah, sure.
Just in relation to the intergenerational cycle. So if the manufacturing jobs are linked to a generation of commercial jobs, so they're linked into that through their family, as you were saying, this disconnection becomes part of a bigger sort of intergeneration of, you know, grandfather and handing down that sort of manufacturing role. So could then that be translated, if we're looking at New Zealand, if they looked at sort of the actual intergenerational purpose of a culture, that would be linked to dislocation? Is that kind of the main, you know, sort of, it's not so much the jobs, as you saw, mass jobs weren't an issue. There was a generational link to being in that, you know, raised by manufacturers and factory workers, and then that gets removed. So then if we looked at it at a closer context, say into New Zealand, are we looking at sort of an intergenerational passing of values and, you know, things that we've known that cause a dislocation? Is that the main point of that?
Yeah, well, I think
there's got to be this sort of intergenerational connection to a main purpose that then gets removed by obviously capitalism or anything else going on, as we've just seen. But the underpinning sort of finding of that study, it wasn't about job loss or anything like that. It's actually moving a whole kind of cultural aspect from them that they've known their whole lives. Yeah, is that the displacement?
I think that's very well put, because what you see in the groups that have suffered from colonial trauma is just that, right? You see a complete, basically, erasure of that intergenerational cultural specific relationality that is basically formed people's anchor, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not capitalism per se, or loss of jobs per se. It's the specific kind of thing that those systems produce, which is this kind of this disruption of relationality that people have with one another. That's right. Where you find meaning in those relationships, and you find some kind of security in the world in knowing that there's some reciprocity between you and others. And when you give decades of service to a company that just then kicks you to the curb, I think that's psychologically and emotionally jarring in a way that another type of maybe job loss isn't where they give you a severance package or something like that, right? Like it's just this complete this separation from people in their relationships that I think is so harmful, which is kind of a feature of these types of systems.
Right.
But
So it's linked to identity a bit, isn't it?
yeah, it's your identity.
Personal identity.
People in these jobs too. I mean, it's the same kind of thing that happened during the Industrial Revolution. You had these people who had grown up, these peasants who had grown up farming their own lands for subsistence for their families. So seeing the process through from seed to caring for the crops to harvesting to, you know, grinding the flour, like all of that stuff. So you're involved in the life cycle of your labor and produce in a way that's like very connected with nature and with the process. And it's very fulfilling. Then you go into the cities in London and you're told to sit for 16 hours a day and sew a button on a piece of fabric, you know? And so there's a form of dislocation that comes from the greater efficiency and things like that that a capitalist system implements, because you're already dislocated from a fulfilling job experience, right? People are working at jobs that they don't care about at all, but that's the only way that they can provide for their families. One of the reasons for that is because in the US, the social programs are really bad because nobody wants to raise taxes on corporations to pay for any of that stuff. So you're working a crappy job for low wages, trying to make ends meet. And you know, you're already disconnected from your family because of the internet and TV and all of this other stuff, because products are constantly getting pushed at you. The bonds that are holding your family together are more and more tenuous. Then when that job, which is your lifeline, is cut, that's the last straw, right? I mean, there's a growing literature on so-called deaths of despair, which are related to this kind of thing, when people just feel like they're down, they're out, and then something happens and it's just that you can't cope anymore, right? That's a severe form of dislocation that is compounded over years and over decades of just completely being bludgeoned by a society that doesn't value you, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, I think that's it's not just a one-time event that we're talking about that results in dislocation. It's accumulation of traumas and things, and then at some point, you just can't do it anymore.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any top tips for final exam essay study? My tip is to focus on models of addiction. That's my my tip. Dante.
I just have a question with the drug policy review.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the bottom here it says like government action plans, right?
Mm.
And so is there where can I go and look at if they actually did these things or not?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have a look at that and send you an email about it. Or I'll send everybody an email. The government websites are kind of hard to navigate. So, but yeah, I imagine they're somewhere on there.
Like it says, develop a system map of potential resilience and intervention points across a person's life stages. Like, where can I actually go see that map that they've supposed to have done by 2016?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not aware of where that map is. Your guess would probably be as good as mine. A lot of those things are quite general, and it's hard to tell whether or not they have any actual specific plan put in place, or whether those are just nice words that sound like they mean something, right? But I'll have a look around and I'll see if I can find anything. And you do too. You let us know if you can find anything about that.
I think they're in the evidence part, those things. Dante. It says that they've applied the frameworks within a hospitals and different things like that, and they've got current. So in the family one, this is just off the top of my head, they've got they're pretty much applying those things within a hospital. So in every evidence case study they've got there, they tell you where they've when they've implemented those things. So there are frameworks implemented through those evidence case studies, Dante. It should tell you where they're actually using those frameworks at the moment.
Oh yeah, so that would be good if there was a summary of that somewhere or something.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's no summary. It's all in the case studies of the individual things that they're playing for evidence of where they've got them situated, but they don't have outcomes. They've just
right. So
they've put them in and how they're going.
They're pointing to things that have worked in other places and saying we're going to take this approach. But yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I imagine what they'll probably do when they come up with another drug policy, which they should be coming up with, right? Because it's overdue at this point, is to say, this is what we said we would do before, this is what we did, this is what we're going to do next. So they will have to have some kind of outcomes analysis at some point, but I don't know if it's out there yet. Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for a great semester, and we'll see you around. Maybe pop in and say hi, or
you don't get the big clap. We're not in there, but thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're amazing.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of the semester.
All the best.
You too. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye.